All right, so welcome to the deep dive. We're going deep today into the super interesting world of AI, specifically how we train these crazy, powerful, large language models to actually reason, like really think things through using reinforcement learning.
Oh, yeah.
You've seen those incredible demos from OpenAI, right?
Right.
And DeepSeek.
Yeah.
Those things are mind-blowing, right?
Absolutely.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
The details of how they actually get these models to perform so well, especially the reinforcement learning part, have been kind of a mystery. It's been like this hidden secret.
Absolutely.
And it's made it pretty tough for researchers, people like you guys who are really into this stuff, to fully understand what's going on under the hood. It's been a bit of a black box.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been this kind of feeling in the community that the real recipe for making reinforcement learning work at scale with these advanced reasoning models,
right,
it hasn't really been, I guess, fully shared, and that's made it tough for everyone to really try to reproduce these amazing results and push the boundaries even further.
Totally.
It's a bit frustrating.
So that's exactly where our focus today comes in. We're diving deep, no pun intended, into a brand new paper called, and get ready for this title, DAPO, an open source LLM reinforcement learning system at scale. Catchy, right?
Yeah.
So this paper, it's hot off the press from ByteDance Seed, AR, at Tsinghua University.
All right.
And the University of Hong Kong's IA Lab.
Great institutions.
It was just published on March 17th, 2025, so super recent.
Yeah.
We'll make sure to link their project page in the description for you guys. It's https://depacia.github.io.
Good.
If you want to check it out after our chat here.
Yeah, for everyone, like the quick 1-minute summary of what this is all about.
Yeah.
The big thing here is that they're introducing this new algorithm called, all right, get ready for it, Decoupled Clip and Dynamic Sampling Policy Optimization.
Oh, wow.
Or DAPO for short.
Thank goodness.
So they've got this DPO algorithm, and they've also created a full, completely open source RL system.
Okay.
They use the Qwen 2.532B base model. Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, familiar with that one.
Pretty popular one. And they managed to score a really impressive 50 points on the AIME 2024 exam.
Wow, 50 points.
Which is a standardized math test.
Mm-hmm.
But what's even more impressive, and this is for you technically minded folks out there, is that they actually surpassed the performance of the previous state-of-the-art model, the DeepSeek model.
Okay.
Which used a similar base model. But get this, they did it using only half the training steps.
Half.
That's a crazy.
Half the training steps. I mean, that's a huge efficiency gain.
Huge, really significant.
Really significant, especially for thinking compute costs, time, all of that.
All of that.
And the fact that it's completely open source, that's crucial. They've released everything. The algorithm, the training code, which is based on the verl framework, even a specially curated data set to make it easier for other researchers to reproduce their results.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So that's kind of our mission for this deep dive, right? We want to understand, really unpack the key innovations that make DPO work so well.
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk about what it actually means, practically speaking, to have a truly open and state-of-the-art reinforcement learning system out there in the world.
Yeah.
Especially for all of you guys who are deep in the AI trenches.
Yeah.
Thinking about how to reproduce this or even build on top of it.
Build on it, improve it even further. Yeah.
Right. Okay, let's get down to the nitty-gritty.
Let's do it.
So, I think it's interesting how the authors of the paper kind of subtly refer to this idea of scalable RL training for these advanced reasoning models as a myth.
Oh, myth. Interesting.
It's like they're saying it's been this elusive thing that people haven't quite cracked. And, when you look at papers from those big players like OpenAI or DeepSeek,
right,
you see those really impressive results, right? Those big numbers.
They're exciting.
But the actual technical specifics,
the
nitty-gritty details of their RL training, the secret sauce, that often gets left out.
Yeah, they don't always share the full recipe, so to speak.
Exactly. It's like watching a magic trick, You see the amazing outcome,
right,
but you have no idea how they did it.
Absolutely.
And you can imagine this makes it really hard for the research community to try to reproduce those kinds of breakthroughs, to replicate those magic tricks.
Yeah, it's like you're missing some key ingredients.
Yeah, and the authors of this paper, they actually talk about how they experienced this themselves. Like, initially, when they try to reproduce some of these results using a standard GRPO approach, a kind of go-to method in reinforcement learning.
Yeah, GRPO, standard stuff.
They only managed to get a score of 30 on the AIME.
Oh, okay.
So that's a pretty big difference compared to DeepSeek's reported 47 points.
Yeah, significant gap there.
And I think that difference, that gap in performance, really highlights how crucial those missing training details probably are. Like there's something going on that's not in the papers.
It's very likely that there are key details, specific techniques that weren't included in those previous reports.
Right.
And those details are precisely what's needed to build a truly scalable and reproducible RL system, one that can actually achieve those top-tier results.
Right, so it's not just about the data.
Yeah, just the whole process.
It's about the whole training methodology and all these little nuances.
Exactly.
And what's so cool about the DPO paper is that they're addressing this head on. They're essentially saying, we're laying it all out there. Here's the full playbook.
Transparency.
Transparency, yeah.
That's what we need.
And the results speak for themselves, right? They hit a 50 on A, beating DeepSeek's performance, and they did it using way less compute, which is, huge for everyone.
Yeah, especially these days with the cost of compute.
And their figure 1 really illustrates this clearly. You can see the difference in training efficiency.
Visually, very clear.
Right, so they're really making a big contribution to making this field more transparent, more accessible to researchers.
Yeah, democratizing AI research in a sense.
Exactly, and that's a big deal. So let's dig into the heart of DPO's breakthrough. They're not just claiming better numbers, they're giving us the tools to understand how they achieved them.
They are.
And a big part of their success, as they explain, comes down to these 4 core algorithmic innovations that they've developed, specifically to tackle those really challenging multi-step reasoning tasks that we see in chain of thought learning, or CUT2 for short.
Yeah, CoT, it's everywhere now.
Yeah. So let's break down each of these 4 pillars one by one, starting with clip higher.
Yeah.
What problem is clip higher designed to solve?
So clip higher, it's really all about addressing this super common issue in reinforcement learning called entropy collapse.
Okay, entropy collapse.
Yeah, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Basically, in their initial experiments using standard methods like proximal policy optimization, or PPO, and generalized proximal policy optimization, GRPO.
Okay, common techniques.
Yeah, very common techniques. They noticed that the model's policy entropy, which is basically a measure of how random or exploratory the model is, it would just plummet as training progressed.
Okay.
And this drop in entropy would happen too early, leading to the model getting stuck, generating very similar responses over and over again.
Okay, so it's not exploring enough.
Exactly. It's like it finds a decent strategy and then just gets stuck in a rut, afraid to try anything new.
Like it's afraid to get creative.
Exactly. It's not venturing out to find potentially better, but maybe less obvious solutions.
It's like it's playing it safe.
Totally. And their figure 2b, if you want to see this visually, really shows this entropy drop when you don't use clip higher.
Yeah, so it's like the model gets too confident too quickly and stops exploring new avenues of thought.
Right, and that's not what we want.
No.
We need that exploration.
So how does clip higher actually fix this?
So the core idea is this. They decouple the upper and lower bounds for how much the probability of an action can change during a policy update in PPO.
Okay, so they're manipulating the boundaries.
Yeah, so you see PPO uses this clipping mechanism to keep the training stable.
Okay.
What they realized was that the standard upper clipping limit, the default epsilon, was kind of unfairly restricting the probability increase of those low probability exploration tokens.
Okay.
Compared to those already high probability exploitation tokens.
Interesting. Can you give us a more concrete example? Like walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So imagine you have 2 possible words that the model could generate next.
Okay.
One has a really low probability at the moment, let's say 1%, and the other one has a high probability, let's say 90%.
Okay, 1% and 90%.
Now, if you apply the standard clipping, say 20%, the low probability word can increase to, it's only about 1.2%.
Okay, that's not much.
Which you get by multiplying 1% by 1, plus the clip, which is 0.2.
Right.
But the high probability word, theoretically, could go all the way up to 108%.
Okay, that's a big jump.
Which is 90% times 1.2. Of course, probabilities can't go over 100%, but you see the point.
Yeah, the absolute increase for that likely word is way bigger.
Way bigger. And what's interesting is they actually looked at this empirically, and in their figure 3a, they show that the maximum probability of those clipped tokens, it often stays below 0.2, which really suggests that this standard upper clipping threshold, it's holding back those less frequent tokens, those potentially creative ones, from getting a chance to shine.
It's stifling their creativity.
It is. It's like saying, stick to what, don't try anything new.
Yeah, stay in your lane.
Right. So their solution was to say, okay, let's increase that upper clipping range, give those underdog tokens a fighting chance.
Makes sense.
So they called this new upper limit Epsilon High.
Okay, Epsilon High.
And by increasing Epsilon High, you're giving those low probability tokens more room to increase their probability, encouraging the model to explore those less traveled paths.
Okay.
Which in turn increases the policy's entropy and leads to a wider variety of responses.
Yeah, so it's like diversifying the model's portfolio.
Exactly. And figure 2 shows this really well. It shows how clip higher helps maintain a nice, healthy level of entropy throughout training.
That's good.
And they also made a smart decision to keep the lower clipping range, Epsilon Low, relatively small.
Okay, why is that?
Because if you aggressively push down the probabilities of those already unlikely tokens, you could accidentally eliminate some potentially useful paths, even if they seem bad at first.
So it's about striking a balance.
Yeah, balancing exploration with making sure you don't throw away potentially valuable options too soon.
It's delicate.
It is.
Okay, so we've tackled clip higher. What's the next technique in their arsenal?
Next up is dynamic sampling.
Dynamic sampling, okay.
And this one tackles a different problem, but just as important. It's all about dealing with vanishing gradients.
Okay, vanishing gradients. That sounds scary.
It can be. So basically, this problem arises when your model starts to get really good at a certain part of the training data.
Okay, so it's doing well.
It's doing too well.
Okay.
Imagine it's consistently getting 100% accuracy on certain prompts across all the different outputs it generates.
Okay, so it's aced that part?
It's aced it.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. When you calculate the advantage in GRPO, which is what guides the model's learning, it's going to be 0 for those perfect prompts.
Okay.
Which means there are no updates for the policy.
Oh, so it stops learning.
It's like the model's saying, hey, I've mastered this. No need to waste time on it anymore.
Right, but that's not good if we want it to keep learning.
Not good at all. And what they found, you can see this in figure 3b, is that the number of these perfect score samples, they just keep piling up during training.
Oh, no.
It's a growing problem.
It's like a growing pile of homework you're ignoring.
Exactly. And that means you're essentially wasting a big chunk of your training data because they're not contributing to the learning signal anymore, those gradient updates.
So how does dynamic sampling, that dynamic part, how does that address this?
Okay, so their solution's actually pretty clever. They oversample the training prompts, so they generate more examples than they need, and then they filter out the prompts where all the generated outputs have either 0% or 100% accuracy.
So they're being selective about which prompts to keep.
They are. And this filtering is crucial because it ensures that every prompt in your training batch has at least some variability in the rewards of its outputs.
Okay, I see.
Which leads to those non-zero advantage estimates, and that keeps the learning going, keeps those gradient signals flowing.
So it's like making sure the model always has something new to chew on.
Precisely.
But doesn't generating all those extra samples, doesn't that make training less efficient?
That's a great question. And you'd think so, right? More samples, more computation.
Right.
But they point out something really interesting. In synchronized distributed RL systems, the overall generation time is often dominated by the slowest samples anyway.
Okay.
So adding a few extra samples might not actually slow things down that much. And more importantly, their empirical results, which you can see in figure 6, actually show that dynamic sampling leads to faster conversions overall, despite the extra sampling. Faster. And that's because you're maintaining a stronger, more consistent learning signal throughout training. You're not letting the model get bored or complacent.
So it's like a little bit of extra effort up front.
Yeah.
But you save time in the long run.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Efficiency through a bit of extra work.
That's cool.
Counterintuitive, but effective.
All right, on to technique number 3. Token level policy gradient loss.
Okay.
So the name kind of gives it away, but this has something to do with how the model's errors are measured.
Well, it's all about the loss function, the thing that tells us how off the model is.
Right.
So in the standard GRPO approach, they calculate the loss at the sample level.
Okay.
Meaning they average the losses across all the tokens within a single generated response.
Okay.
And then average those sample level losses across the whole batch of responses.
So it's like taking the average temperature of the whole room.
Yeah, you get a general sense of things, but you miss the details.
Right.
And the problem they notice with this, especially with those long chain of thought reasoning tasks,
Right.
is that when you have these long, potentially really good responses with lots of tokens,
Yeah.
each token's individual contribution to the loss gets kind of diluted in that sample level average.
It gets washed out.
It does. It's like a drop of ink in a huge bucket of water the impact is small.
Right, it's a diluted.
And on the flip side, if you have these super long responses that maybe have some bad parts, like gibberish or just repetitive stuff,
Right.
those bad parts might not get penalized enough at the sample level because their badness gets averaged out with the good parts.
So you're not really targeting the specific problems.
Exactly. And you can actually see this happening in their figure 4A and 4B.
Yeah.
They show how this sample level averaging can actually lead to unwanted increases in the model's entropy, like we talked about before.
Right.
And in the average length of the responses without actually making the reasoning better.
So the model gets chattier but not smarter.
It's like it's rambling without really saying anything meaningful.
Yeah, so they needed a more precise way to measure those errors.
They did. So they introduced the token level policy gradient loss.
Token level.
And with this, the loss is calculated and then aggregated at the level of each individual token across all the generated responses.
Okay, so instead of averaging over the whole response,
Yeah.
you're looking at each word or each subword.
Each little piece of the puzzle.
And how does that help?
So this offers two big advantages. First, those longer, high-quality sequences, because they have more tokens,
Right.
they have a bigger influence on the gradient updates.
Oh, I see.
So the model learns more effectively from those good reasoning chains.
The good stuff gets amplified.
Exactly. And second, any bad pattern that happens at the token level, like repetition or nonsensical words, those get consistently penalized or rewarded no matter how long the overall response is.
So it's like a more fine-grained control over the learning process.
Exactly. You're not letting those bad patterns hide within a longer sequence.
Okay, so it's about precision and targeting the specific areas that need improvement.
It is.
Cool. Okay, let's move on to the fourth and final technique, overlong reward shaping.
Okay.
This one sounds like it's about how the model gets penalized for writing too much.
Yeah, it's all about handling those overly verbose responses.
So in typical RL training for text generation, you usually set a limit on how long a response can be, right?
Right, a maximum length.
And anything that goes beyond that limit, you just chop it off.
You truncate it.
Yeah, truncate it. And the usual approach is to just give a negative reward to those truncated samples.
Right, like a punishment for writing too much.
But the authors argue that this can actually create problems. Do you see why?
Yeah, because you might have a perfectly good line of reasoning, logically sound, that just happens to be a bit wordy, and it gets penalized just for its length, even if all the steps were correct and it led to the right answer.
Right, so it's like punishing someone for explaining their thinking thoroughly.
Exactly. That can really confuse the model about what's actually good reasoning.
It's like mixed messages.
It is. So they actually started with a simpler approach called overlong filtering,
Okay.
where they basically ignored the loss for those truncated samples. They just masked it out.
So they're not punishing, but they're not rewarding either.
Right, just neutral.
And how did that work?
Well, surprisingly, even this simple change led to better training stability and better performance on A, which you can see in Figure 5.
Wow, so just ignoring those overlong responses helped.
It did.
But they didn't stop there, right?
No, they refined this idea further into what they call soft overlong punishment.
Okay, soft punishment.
Yeah, a more gentle approach. So instead of a harsh fixed penalty, they introduced a gradual penalty that kicks in once the response goes beyond a certain length.
Okay.
So they set a maximum length minus a little cache of tokens.
Okay.
And once the response goes beyond that threshold, the penalty starts small and slowly increases as the response gets longer within that cache window.
So it's like a warning, like, hey, you're getting a bit long-winded here.
Exactly, a gentle nudge. And then once it goes beyond the absolute maximum, it gets a bigger fixed penalty.
Okay, so it's a more nuanced way of controlling the length.
It is.
Instead of just this harsh cutoff.
It gives the model more guidance and avoids those sudden confusing penalties.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've covered all four of their key algorithmic innovations. Those are the cornerstones of DPO.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about their approach to reward modeling, which is, how the model actually learns what's good and what's bad.
Right.
So they didn't use a separate learned reward model, did they?
No, they went with a rule-based approach, which is interesting.
Okay, so explain what that means.
So they directly used the final task accuracy as the reward signal.
Okay, straightforward.
Yeah. So if the model gets the answer right, it gets a reward of +1.
Okay,
If it gets it wrong, it gets -1.
simple.
Simple. And they use this function called isequivalent to check if the model's answer matches the correct answer.
So it's like a binary reward.
Exactly. Right or wrong, no in between.
So why did they choose this direct, rule-based reward instead of training a separate model to predict how good the responses are?
Well, one big reason is to avoid the problem of reward hacking.
Reward hacking, that sounds sneaky.
It is. It's when the model figures out how to game the reward function without actually learning the task properly.
Oh, so it's getting a good score without really understanding?
Exactly. It's like finding a loophole in the system.
Yeah, like cheating on a test.
Right. And by directly using the task accuracy as the reward, they make sure the model is actually learning to solve the problems, not just to maximize the reward.
So it's like keeping the model honest.
It is. And they point out that this approach has worked really well in other areas too, like theorem proving, programming, even those complex math competitions.
Okay, so it's a proven method.
Yeah, it keeps the model focused on the real goal.
Makes sense. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about the data. The quality of the training data is crucial for these complex reasoning tasks.
Absolutely. Data is everything.
So where did they get their data from?
So they mainly use two sources. The Art of Problem Solving website, AOPS,
AOPS.
which is a popular website for math problems, and the official websites of various math competitions.
Okay, so they're getting real-world problems.
Real-world challenging problems.
Yeah.
They used a combination of web scraping to collect the problems and then manual annotation to make sure the data was clean and accurate.
So a mix of automation and human effort.
Yeah, you need both for good data.
But they ran into a challenge with the answers, right?
Yeah, a big one. So you see, in math problems, the answers can come in all sorts of forms.
Right, different formats.
You have numbers, equations, formulas, all kinds of stuff. And that makes it really hard to automatically check if the model's answer is correct, especially for their rule-based reward system.
It's like trying to compare apples and oranges.
Exactly. So how do you compare a simple number to a complex formula?
Right, it's tricky.
So they needed a clever solution.
So what did they do?
They took inspiration from the AIME competition itself, which is one of the benchmarks they used. And they developed this really neat data transformation process where they systematically turn the expected answers into integers.
Integers, so whole numbers.
Whole numbers, yeah. Much easier to work with.
So how did they do that?
So let's say the original answer to a problem was something like a plus the square root of b divided by c.
Okay, yeah, that's a complex one.
They would change the question itself so that the expected answer became a plus b plus c.
So they're rewriting the problems to simplify the answers.
Exactly. And this integer format is much easier to parse automatically and compare using their isequivalent function.
So it's like standardizing the answers.
Exactly. And this whole process led to their DPO Math 17K dataset, which has 17,000 prompts, all with those nice, clean integer answers.
That's a lot of math problems.
It is. And they also used a chain of thought framework during this transformation process, which is interesting.
Okay, what's the purpose of that?
So to make sure the model could correctly handle this whole rewriting process, going from those complex answers to integers, they guided it through this specific four-step reasoning framework.
Okay, 4 steps.
First, the model had to figure out the original answer format.
Okay.
Then rewrite the problem to expect an integer answer.
Okay.
Then actually solve the modified problem to get that integer answer.
And finally, output that integer as the target answer.
Exactly. And they use a few shot examples and detailed guidelines to teach the model how to do this.
So they're really hand-holding the model through this process.
Yeah, to make sure it learns to transform the data correctly and consistently.
So they've put a lot of effort into this.
A lot of thought and effort into every stage, from the algorithms to the data preparation.
Which makes sense, because garbage in, garbage out, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, now for the moment of truth. The experimental results. They claim to outperform the previous state of the art. Can you remind us what those numbers were?
Yeah, so as we mentioned at the start, DEO achieved a 50% accuracy on the AM 2024 benchmark using that Quinn 2.532b base model.
Okay, 50%. That's impressive.
Very impressive. And what's really important here is that they beat the previous best model, DeepSeek R10 32b, which got 47% accuracy.
Okay, so they're on top.
They are. And remember, they did it with half the training steps.
Half the steps. That's huge.
Really efficient. You can see this clearly in their figure 1. The difference is pretty stark.
So each of their innovations, they really contribute to this success.
Yeah, and to see exactly how much each technique contributed, they did this thing called an ablation study.
Okay, an ablation study.
Where they systematically remove each of the 4 key techniques one by one and see how the performance changes.
So like a controlled experiment.
Exactly, like taking apart a machine to see how each part works.
Deep sense. So what did they find?
So they started with a basic GRPO implementation, No fancy tricks.
Okay.
That only got 30% accuracy.
30%, so pretty low.
Yeah, the baseline. Then they added each of their innovations one by one.
Okay.
First, they added overlong filtering, which bumped it up to 36%.
Okay, that's a decent jump.
Yeah, a good start. Then clip higher, which took it to 38%.
Okay, so each technique is adding a bit more.
They are. They all work together. Then soft overlong punishment brought it to 41%. Token level loss nudged it to 42%. And finally, dynamic sampling brought it all the way up to 50%.
Wow, so dynamic sampling had the biggest impact.
It did, in terms of that final accuracy. But it's important to note that they all play a crucial role.
Right, they all contribute.
And even though token level loss only gave a small boost in accuracy, they found that it really helped to stabilize the training process, which is just as important.
Yeah, stability is key.
Absolutely. And they also highlight that although dynamic sampling needs more data sampling, it actually reduces the overall training time because the model converges faster.
So again, a little extra work up front pays off later.
Yeah, it's all about long-term efficiency.
So I guess this really highlights how complex reinforcement learning for LLMs is, right? It's not just about tweaking one thing, it's about understanding how all these different pieces fit together.
Absolutely. It's a systems problem.
The whole ecosystem.
You have to think about the algorithms, the data, the reward function, everything.
And small changes can have big effects.
They can, which is why monitoring is so important.
Right, so they talked about monitoring some key metrics during training. Can you remind us what those were and why they're so important?
Yeah, so they kept a close eye on things like the length of the generated responses,
Okay, response length.
the average reward signal,
Okay.
and the entropy of the actor model.
So why those specific metrics?
Well, they're like vital signs. You know, they give you a sense of how healthy the training process is.
Okay, so it's like checking the model's pulse.
Exactly. So, for example, the length of the responses, that can tell you how much the model is exploring different possibilities.
Okay.
If the responses are getting longer and longer, that might be a good sign initially.
Like it's exploring more.
But if it suddenly stops or the responses get shorter, especially if the accuracy is dropping, that could be a warning sign.
Like something's wrong?
Yeah, it could mean the model is getting stuck or collapsing onto a small set of solutions.
So it's like the model's imagination is shrinking.
Exactly. It's not being creative anymore.
Yeah.
And then